don't have it like written down or protected and saved to bring it to us, but that doesn't mean that it did not happen.
What a queen. Hi everyone, welcome to OSA Backstage. I'm Dani Meyer, and on today's episode, Serena and I get to do the best thing ever, which is deep dive music with the best people. That's right. Mathew Fuerst and Nicole Cowan join us to talk Brahms and the Schumanns, Robert and Clara. It is amazing how you can talk for an hour and still feel like you've barely scratched the surface, but I think that just means that you have found something interesting. And we have definitely, humble opinion, I think we've definitely found something interesting. This is definitely geared towards Masterworks 5, which is at the end of March, and you'll hear why. But we started this conversation back last weekend with Jocelyn too, when we talked about Robert Schumann's Final Symphony. And this relationship, the effect they had on each other, the friendship they had, the support system they had is really extraordinary and one of the coolest parts about the 19th century and music history in general. So I'm really glad that these guys were up for the best in rabbit holes and tangents. I hope you're going to love it. I know you're going to love it. Enjoy. Okay, so let me tee this up a little bit because Matt, you and I have done this once.
Yep.
But we did like kind of a deep dive, and I was super excited, Nicole, when you joined the team, because as far as I know, we've never had a musicologist on staff before.
Oh no.
And you waltzed in and you're like, by the way, I love all the things. I love the pre-concert talks. I love writing the notes. I love music history. Check, sign me up. Like, fantastic. How do I rope Nicole into all things nerdy from go? So I think the best thing we could do to get this deep dive started, and I hope we'll be able to do more of these in different concerts, is to have you all introduce yourselves as much or as little as you would like. Nicole, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, I appreciate being called a musicologist. I do have a musicology degree. So I'm originally from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I like to say if you've been to the Dallas-Fort Worth airport, you've been to my house because I lived 5 minutes away. I have a degree in flute performance from Texas Christian University, and I'm the kind of kid that liked to do literally everything if possible. And so, I have a degree in flute, but then I decided performing wasn't quite for me. And so I went to Indiana University, and where I come from most recently. And I got a master's degree in musicology and library science. I am an orchestra librarian by trade, and I did start that when I was getting my degrees. So I've jumped around a lot, but I think I've settled on quite a lovely little mix of doing the library work that I really, really love. And then on the side, when my brain decides to have enough time to do some history and do some deep diving and tell fun stories. I think that's kind of my favorite part about being in this sphere and like a public concert kind of way, is just like, there's so many things that I don't know, and there's so many things that other people don't know, that makes all of this history so cool and so much more alive than I think the maybe broad public gives it credit for. And so I really, really enjoy any space to, engage in that intellectual diversity and that engagement with other people.
Yeah. Matt?
I'm Mathew Fuerst. I write the program notes for the Omaha Symphony. I'm in my 3rd season doing that. I'm a composer, teach composition online. And we currently live actually just a little bit outside Chicago, moved here about a year and a half ago. Yeah.
And Serena?
My name is Serena. I'm the assistant conductor of the Omaha Symphony, and Dani and I have this podcast because we enjoy all things nerdy, and so this is going to be super, super fun. We just performed Schumann's 4th Symphony, so I think this really comes at the right time. You have a little bit of context, and now we're here to go on some tangents.
That is exactly right. And the specific tangent that we're so excited about is actually going to come to fruition in Masterworks 5 in March. And that is, we've been, the concert title, I think, is Brahms' 4th Symphony, but we've been calling it internally Brahms and the Schumanns, because the piece opens up with a work by Eun Suk Jin inspired by Beethoven's legacy in honor of his 250th birthday. And then you have
Clara Schumann's Piano Concerto, which is just sublime, and Brahms Symphony Number 4. And so you might be thinking, well, where is Robert Schumann and all of that? But we're going to get to that. Robert Schumann's hands are in everything. And so, Nicole, I want to open the floor with you. What do you think of? What's your first response when I say the name Johannes Brahms or the Schumanns to you? Where do you go?
A lot of different places. I think the funniest little aside is a colleague that I was studying musicology with used to say that Brahms was like nothing. He was like, honestly, I don't understand the hype around Brahms. I just, he just sounds like Beethoven and he doesn't really do anything interesting. And I find that so funny because the way that and I think it's a way that I think about a lot of things is there's a real incredible talent about being able to synthesize a lot of different ideas and a lot of different worlds into specific sounds. And I think that's something that Brahms extremely excelled in and just was able to take all of these super disparate ideas, folk songs, Bach, Beethoven, Schumann, Schubert, everything, and blend it into these lovely, just beautiful masterworks. So I think that is the very first little thing that pops into my head. I think it's so, in my mind, so silly, but I think there is a way that can come out because it sometimes does sound like, they call Brahms 1, Beethoven 10, but that's okay. He was still learning how to do symphonies. Anyway, I also love, I have a specific love for Clara Schumann. I think that woman was booked and busy. She was so impressive. She had, starting from just the basics of, she had 8 children. Imagine just trying to, I can't imagine even taking care of a 400 square foot house, let alone so many children and a completely robust performance career of her own, but also a champion of new works, of her husband's works, but also of all works of both her friends and people that she admired and viewed as important figures. I think I have a lot more to say about Clara. I did a whole presentation about her in class for one project in musicology, but I will stop there to let some other people.
Okay, so that's amazing. So you're coming at it from, look at the incredibly extraordinary way these people brought their entire environment around them and then also hustled their buns off, especially in Clara's case. Okay, amazing. Matt, same question. What do you think when we talk, what comes to mind when Brahms or the Schumanns are brought up?
So I was thinking a little bit about this, and I have to admit that for me, I come from the perspective of structure and of their works. And I should give a caveat in saying that I heard someone once say that anytime a composer talks about someone else's music, they reveal just as much about themselves as they do about the music. And so I will readily admit that I've been thinking myself a lot about form and structure and what that means and so forth. But for me, when looking at and thinking about their music, what strikes me is how absolutely different the Schumanns and Brahms seem to be, in terms of Brahms being, for the most part, really, working within the classical structures, though there are certainly areas where he kind of expands and things like this. But in thinking about the Schumann Fourth Symphony that the Omaha Symphony just did, and then over the weekend spending some time again with the Clara Schumann Piano Concerto, what I marveled at is how inventive the Schumanns are in terms of structure and form. That seems extraordinarily 19th century. And that I'm finding myself, as much as I love Brahms and he's a hero of mine, I'm finding more and more fascination and I find myself thinking much more about the Schumanns these days and just what it means with their approach to Clara Schumann, in her case, the Piano Concerto, and Robert Schumann, the Fourth Symphony, both of which are just extraordinary in their innovations of structure and form, which I find just amazing.
Which is definitely a big deal, because people seem to dismiss Robert Schumann's orchestra, myself included, for a long time. They would dismiss his orchestra writing kind of from go. It's like, stick to your piano and your leader, Robert. Serena, same question.
I would say, I think like they lived at the same time, but for me, the biggest difference is in like the sound worlds that they can really create. Like a Schumann symphony really sounds nothing like a Brahms symphony to me, and how thickly orchestrated. I mean, we talked about how funny it was that Brahms actually championed the version of Robert Schumann's Symphony No. 4 that was lighter in orchestration than the one that was originally published, considering how heavy we consider Brahms's instrumentation or orchestration, I should say, is, and how he doubles things, and just that kind of like thick, sustained sound that we expect from Brahms. And then to hear things like Spring, and to hear things like his Forte, just that all that kind of lively, sprightly kind of music that comes from Robert Schumann. It's really interesting, and also comparing the kinds of music. We like to compare them a lot. But Robert wrote so many more, like in terms of the song situation, and Brahms was so much more in the orchestral, that it almost feels like they had different passions when it came to composing. That it is interesting to compare and contrast, but still remembering, although we think of them together, like what I think the differences are what makes them so interesting for me.
I agree, and I think we should talk about. We keep lumping them together, and the reason is because we're going to get to a place where Schumann is going to become a huge influence in Brahms's life, and then Brahms is going to kind of join with Robert and Clara in this really extraordinary friendship for the rest of all of their lives. But let's really quickly, Nicole, can we circle back to when it was just Clara and Robert? Because if I have this right, so Robert was 9 years older than Clara. He was born in 1810. Clara was born in 1819. And they met roughly 1829 when Robert started studying piano with Clara's father, Frederick Wieck. So can we talk a little bit about what was happening and what Clara was doing and Robert's kind of like Robert shenanigans at the time?
I can try to speak on some of that. I mean, I think one of the funniest things to me is that Clara's father did not like Robert and did not like him for her specifically. But Robert was obsessed with Clara. I have so many notes and like notes from his letters of how much he admired her, how beautiful he thought she was, all of these things. In terms of like all of Robert's escapades, I might have to ask somebody else to cover that little bit. I'm kind of, from where I know from, is like kind of when they really get together, and their relationship towards each other, and right, like leading up to their marriage.
Perfect, Matt. I'm going to tag you in, so I'll give you some. I feel like, Nicole, I'm just throwing everybody to the deep end with concrete blocks, but it's more fun that way. So, Matt, prior to them meeting, what would have been heard? What would have been available for Robert Schumann to hear? Beethoven 1, Beethoven 5, Schubert 9, Beethoven 9, and Mendelssohn Midsummer Night's Dream. All of that music would have been available for Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann to take in. So, in that context, what kind of sound world are we in for orchestras?
In what sense?
What kind of, Serena talked about like thickness versus sprightliness. Like, how are we treating our orchestras? What is Beethoven doing? I think is maybe a better question that is setting up the future Robert Schumanns and Johannes Brahmses and Clara Schumanns of the world.
I think in general, it's the one reads a lot about it. It applies not just, I think, to the orchestral world, but just Beethoven in general. When you look at some of the harmonic progressions that he'll do. So, for example, modulating to the mediant, which is a third away from the tonic as opposed to the dominant for the second themes, which is pretty typical. So example, in the Waldstein Sonata, the second theme's in E major. You would typically expect it to be in G major as the whole piece is in C, but Beethoven through modal mixture, which is when you combine the major and the minor keys and switch back and forth, is able to expand all the possibilities of where one can go harmonically. You think about that, you think about some of the things one might see with Mendelssohn with kind of harmonic progressions that are a little more innovative. I think you see some of that in Schumann's works. I'm thinking particularly of like the early works of like Papillon and Carnaval. Similarly, in terms of structure, expanding what structure means, the organization of musical ideas. And I think, thinking back of Schumann 4 and just the innovations that we see with that. And even in the Clara Schumann piano concerto, like there's some harmonies there that I think actually precede what Liszt will do, 20, 30 years later. There's some really extraordinary things in that, as well as the cyclical form, which, you see a little bit of that with like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, with the bum, 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 bum theme happening throughout. But you see some of that with the Robert Schumann Fourth Symphony. You see it clearly with the Clara Schumann piano concerto with the two outer movements, brilliantly done. I think just the whole concept of form and what form means, along with the possibilities of harmony, kind of coincide. And I wouldn't be surprised if one could throw Berlioz in there as well as someone that was probably highly influential in this sort of thinking. But again, that's where my head's at anyways, and looking at this music. So do we know if they would have been like, how easy would it have been for them to go experience concerts at that time?
I can talk on this a little bit if you want. One thing that I love about this time period is there's just so much, like, we're seeing really the rise of the middle class. Everything is getting more accessible. So instruments specifically are being more industrialized. So it's cheaper to purchase them. More people can have them in their homes. And not only and because of that, we see the rise of a lot of like chamber spaces and a lot of music being heard that were these larger forms being transcribed, adapted for smaller groups. There was a lot of this like salon culture. Clara had salons in her space, but also just around all of these important people meeting and listening to this music via playing it and experiencing it, not just as a listener, but as an artist. Not only is it a lot of these pieces, Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, are being like used to train Clara and Robert and all of their students. It's how you see so many on the early repertoire is those really like foundational pieces. But then you also see that later on and championed by these composers. I think a really fun, in terms of like places where music was being performed in a more public space, we don't see it at the very beginning of the 19th century, but it starts to become bigger and more popular. We see the rise of the conductor. At first, the way that we practice, that we set up a concert now is by no means the way that it looked in the 19th century. Rehearsals sometimes, but largely no. Like I said, the conductor, the idea of the baton, something that, as we're getting like Mendelssohn and pushing forward. But there was the Gewandhaus in Leipzig, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was originally a guild hall for like cloth merchants. But they put on this music series that got bigger and more popular, and more people were going to the point that they had to keep renovating the space to make it hold more people until eventually it couldn't. But becomes such an important concert house. We see so many performers going here. So we have Mozart's performance in Leipzig, where we heard piano concertos. We have Clara's first public piano recital. We have Beethoven's Fifth Piano Concerto being premiered there, Schubert's C Major Symphony being premiered there, Schumann's First Symphony, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, Brahms's Violin Concerto. Wagner, every single voice that, like every pop famous person of the Romantic era goes through this one house. And I think it's like, it's a perfect snapshot of like what everything was going around to like experience this music, but also people playing it in their homes. And I don't know, I just think it's a cool space that reflects what was happening in the broader public of music.
That's amazing. I especially love the idea that you're getting, because Serena and I, we talk occasionally about the Beethoven curse when it comes to a first symphony, right? Because Beethoven's standard, what he chose to do and how he chose to transform things, meant that anybody who chose to write something called a symphony after the fact had to contest with that bar. So it had to be innovative, but not scandalous. And it had to be new and exciting, but not, it still had to follow the rules. And the rules were kind of like changed and made up at points. But so you're saying though that like not only were people given more chances than ever to experience the music as a concert goer, at least in the sense of the 19th century, but they could have heard it in their own living room. So in Clara's case, do we know when she started piano, and do we know if she was like exposed to fantastic pianists first? Like, would her father have been a key figure in that?
Somewhat. I would have to, that part I didn't quite get to when I was doing my kind of research. I do know that, like because of the rise of publishing, people had access to a lot more of this music. Both, you know, we see Breitkopf and Hartel, names that we recognize as publishers now, but music is being disseminated a lot more via paper. And so she would have absolutely had, Bach organ pieces and, you know, there might have been a Beethoven transcription hanging around there. Like we see a lot of this. I would say she would have access to that music in a public space, but also really as part of her training as a young pianist.
I just want to add a little bit of context, I think, also before, because we talk about classical music, but we're talking about these different periods now. And this period that we're talking about here is kind of this romantic period. But what happened before this classical period, which is that Mozart, Haydn that we're talking about, that the Brahms and Schumann of the romantic had access to, that musical life was different from what Nicole was talking about, in that was mostly about courts. So you kind of had these people in positions of power that were holding kingdoms, courts, and things like that were paying as patrons for composers like Mozart and Haydn to write court music. So at that point, symphonies were much smaller in instrumentation, fewer musicians, because it was more of like a court orchestra, things like that. And that is what Beethoven did then, is kind of move that from court music, symphonies being court music, to being for the public. And he, you know, going from Beethoven 1 to Beethoven 9, he expands how many players are on stage, who is playing in the orchestra, what instruments. He's adding trombones all of a sudden, all the woodwinds plus choir, right, in Beethoven 9. So all of these, like, so then you have Brahms and Robert and Clara kind of sitting at the end of this transition from classical to romantic that we get throughout Beethoven. And I think that is kind of important to imagine, that what life was like in kind of the generation before, and then how Beethoven, you know, transitioned them into this time where things were so much more accessible, the arrival of the printing press, and everything. And now they are studying these works, and everything that Beethoven built up, like Dani was saying, also became this big cloud that was hanging over now.
Is it fair to say, and Matt, I'm especially curious your opinion on this because you teach, is it fair to say that this embarrassment of riches that we have, the hundreds of years that we have of the classical music genre as a whole, so not just the classical period, but also the Romantic and the Baroque and the Renaissance, is that embarrassment of riches still fairly new then?
I would say it has grown from that. I think when talking about embarrassment of riches and what's accessible to individuals or musicians and young composers and things like that, I think the internet has an equal part of an importance to this, where one can access any music of any time of anybody, more music than ever, things like that. So in that regard, I think that embarrassment of riches has only just grown. I do think that composers still have a bit of that the weight of history on their shoulders. I would be lying
Just
if I would say I didn't feel that. But I also think what has happened, at least for today, and maybe I'm getting a little bit off topic here, forgive me, but is an openness to all sorts of music that is, I think, very unique to this century, as opposed to some other centuries where everything was kind of, you had pop music here, you had classical music here, you had jazz here, everything else. Now, because of the easy access to all this music, and I think even back when I was still living in New York, before the iPod, carrying 20 or 30 CDs in my bag every day because I just had no idea what I'd want to listen to put in my Discman. Got that thing, suddenly I had 50 days of music that I could listen to anything I wanted. And so what's interesting is I think the embarrassment of riches has also changed composers' thoughts in terms of just music being music, and there's a certain freedom that has come from that as well. So maybe I've not quite answered the question. I'm sorry if I kind of veered off somewhere else and misinterpreted it, but it is something that has grown, but it's interesting to see the impact of that after about 20 or so years already in the way composers think about music.
That's great. I think I'm also interested to know, it's, we're describing this place where you suddenly have access to more composers than ever. If you're in the 19th century, you suddenly have access to a Mozart symphony or a Beethoven symphony or a Mendelssohn concerto. I think, Bach has always been on the piano stand, right? Like, I've never not lived in a world where you couldn't use Anna Magdalena to teach something. And so I want to put a pin real fast in the internet comment map, because I want to because Schumann didn't have that, but he did have the Zeitschrift for music. No, it's great. I want to put a pin in that, but I really want to go back to, so Clara had access to Bach. So now I'm wondering, do we have an inkling of when people realized Bach was quite handy, or is that like with the printing press and just the distribution, or was it just being in Leipzig and being near Bach's kind of hometown, if that helped with that? Can we?
Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
Go on.
Okay. I was going to say, I think another really important factor in all of this is the rise of the importance of just art in absolute general. So we're talking poetry, literature, the sciences even, becoming like well-read and well-versed in history, all of these, paintings, every little bit of art, I think really like that becomes such an important thing, and having opinions about that art and having that influence how you create was a very important ideal in this time. The new Zeitschrift, I think is really great. It's a great point to bring up, because if you look at how he writes, and if you look at how other people were writing around the time, so much of the language changes and it becomes so artful in the way that words are specifically put together to explain something. We have this idea that, and especially coming from Mendelssohn and Robert, and to an extent Clara, of words also somehow not being enough to explain everything. Music, this idea of music as a indefinite, you can't quite put a point on it. Mendelssohn's Song Without Words is a really good example. You see Robert and other people talking about this music and saying, there is no real way to fully express it, because music just goes beyond that. It's a level of spirituality that like music alone or art alone without words can create. And so I think, knowing about Bach and listening to his music and playing it in concerts, especially, and like bringing that up and using that to inform your own practice and then also just inform your own discussions with other people around you. I think it's just kind of like microcosm of a lot of really interesting ideas. And that's I think part of the reason why we see this emphasis on medieval and like older things being brought back into this time period, because people find the importance of it to both like talk about but also inform the future.
There's so many rabbit holes we can go down. I don't know which one. Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of them, right? So Nicole, you brought up music is creating something that is almost beyond expression, beyond using physical words, right? Then we have the split that happened before Brahms really came on the scene, but it was the Wagners of the world versus the Brahmses of the world. And Matt, can you talk a little bit about what Wagner, because we talk about pure music over here with Max Reger and Johannes Brahms and all the good stuff, but Wagner had a different idea. And what was that idea?
It was basically the idea of programmatic music, meaning that something extra musical, whether it was a poem or a historical event or whatever it might be, a painting, will inform the musical ideas, if not directly in terms of using kind of, text painting, like, trying to imitate the sound of raindrops or whatever it might be, to actually, informing the structure of a piece of music, and this kind of concept in the orchestral world really started with Franz Liszt with his symphonic poems. And so you start to see that split between, like you said, the absolute music of Johannes Brahms, who, typically adheres more to the classical structures, and then this more, this different approach to structure and music making with the programmatic music. So two completely different worlds, though. I will say, to me, it's amazing how much there is a bit of overlap between the two. And again, I think this is where Schumann comes in. Oddly enough, perhaps setting Brahms on the direction of being the absolute music, figurehead, with his article proclaiming him the heir to Beethoven, which what 20-year-old wants that on their shoulders, right?
No 20-year-old.
Right. But you look at Schumann's music, and what I find just so, what I love so much about Schumann is it seems to combine these two things, which I find absolutely fascinating. Again, going back to the Fourth Symphony as an example of this, it just, just this different concept of structure that goes beyond what was classically done by, Mozart, Haydn, and even, some of the earlier Beethoven symphonies.
Yes. And it's what's fantastic about this setup is you have someone like Schumann who, whether he's doing it on purpose or not, is straddling both. He's using some of the concepts that Wagner would espouse. And we look at this Fourth Symphony, even Spring, yes, it has a name, but it's not a program. It's not even Beethoven 6, where it's like, a guy goes for an adventure, gets caught in the rain, and everyone lives happily ever after. It's fine. But it's an opinion. There was very much, and not just an opinion in the music world, but a rift. And Schumann would be there because to inform everybody about this rift and about the directions of where the world is going. Because without the internet, he had the next best thing, which was a magazine, the Neue Zeitschrift for Musik, he co-founded, and I believe, yes, in 1834. And that was it was not going to say our YouTube at the time, but like as close as you can get, right? And so this is where Matt, he does what you just said. He's poking around, he's listening, he's having access to all these concerts. He's been sitting in piano lessons with Frederick Wieck now for like 5 years. And Clara must be well aware at this point, Nicole, that he's totally obsessed with her. But he starts this magazine, he hears Brahms. I do not know the exact circumstance, but he does what you said, which is he proclaims him to be the next coming of Beethoven. He puts Beethoven's legacy firmly on Brahms's shoulders. And what I think happens next was really fascinating to me, because Brahms could have essentially he could have crumbled one. He could have given Robert Schumann the bird and walked away either into obscurity or at least just as far away from Robert Schumann as humanly possible. But he chose option number 3, which has become lifelong best friends with Robert and Clara Schumann. And so this is where I want to go back to, Nicole. If we can deep dive back into your history of Clara Schumann. They meet Brahms in 1851. But before that, Clara and Robert would meet, they would defy her father, they would get married, they would be happily in love. So let's put us there before the Brahms stuff happened.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. I have a thought in my brain. I'm not going to forget about it, about how Brahms feels about Schumann before all that. So I'm going to try to remember that. But I think a good place to go with like their love story. We have so many things. I actually have looked at least one letter that Robert wrote to Clara, and kind of it's encapsulated in this little quote of, "We shall indeed lead a life of poetry and blossoms, and we well play and compose together like angels and bring gladness to mankind." I think is, first of all, beautiful, like gorgeous, amazing poetry. Truly, like his writing is lovely, but I think it really expresses the way that their relationship worked, at least especially in the earlier parts of their relationship. They were seated at the piano together, playing all the time. There's a quote that Robert is speaking to Mendelssohn saying, "Oh, we were playing some of your organ sonatas. Unfortunately, we only had the piano to perform them on, but we find them so beautiful." Their life together was the same kind of microcosm that I was talking about earlier of art and culture and music. And because they were both performers and composers, they talked about music. I can just imagine how they describe music to each other. And, Robert would give music in the form of give gifts in form of albums where there will be songs in there that he has written, sometimes fragments of music, sometimes full pieces, sometimes of other composers and other works, poetry, art combined into these beautiful albums, which we still have. A former teacher of mine, that's her whole area. So I'm going to shout out Helena Goldberg at IU. Seriously, if you're interested at all in that, her work, that's amazing. But they were working together. Clara later on is taking a lot of his music and premiering it on her own concerts. That is, how they made a lot of their money was Clara was performing. And she had this beautiful way of combining a lot of people's ideas into her own works, or as she introduced pieces through preludes and little things in between. But she was writing transcriptions. She was there at the premieres of all of his works, sometimes writing transcriptions based on his orchestral pieces. And he describes her. He says that for her untiring zeal and energy in her art, she really deserves everyone's love and encouragement, which is, again, beautiful and wonderful. And Robert championed, we don't know exactly what happened completely in their domestic space, but, he championed her as a composer and as a performer in her own right. And really, it was she was the one making all the money. It was because of her that they survived a lot of the time. But you can just tell how much he writes about her in words, writes about her in music, how much they really loved and cared for each other, and their brains just really were a lovely, lovely match.
I tell my husband to up his poetry game. There's a lot there. There's a lot there to unpack because it's so gorgeous. I think my follow-up question would be, did Robert he had obviously the highest regard for Clara's music and her performances. Do you think that was evident in the information that he was channeling out, say, through the noise I drift? Or would he have stuck with the more acceptable conversation pieces at the time, which were unfortunately the big boys?
I mean, I think from what I have looked at, it was a lot more in that domestic kind of space, like letters to friends. I did not find anything, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. That just means I didn't see it. That especially the way that he would talk about music, it seemed like he was more talking about the big boys more often than not.
So now let's unpin that question of what did Brahms think about Robert Schumann, and then we can talk about the three of them as a unit.
So I was doing some reading, and there's a really funny phrase, and it said that Brahms had kind of tossed out Schumann as he had listened to some of his works, heard some of it, and was like, nah, he's not that great, which is hilarious. And then through the meeting of Josef Joachim, the violinist, who was also friends with Clara and Robert, he imparted onto Brahms to give it another shot, meet with them, speak with them. And so he kind of took back up this okay, I'll re-look into them. And suddenly he was on their doorstep being like, hi, I'm really interested in the work that you've done. And then they become friends. I'm leaving out some details that are a little fuzzy for me, but that's kind of the broad stroke of that. So it was, he's just fine to I really actually should be friends with these people and work with them. And I think that's that's another, a somewhat, maybe not juvenile, but just not fully understanding or working through a composer's work. Same kind of thing that society did for a lot of composers, and we only now see them as masters of the genres that they wrote in. Stuff of that, of revisiting and rethinking to then discover what you can learn that you may have dismissed previously.
I love that. And for context too, Brahms wasn't born until 1833. So my guy was he's 23 years younger than Schumann, and he would have been very much a juvenile bébé when he was first mentioned by Robert Schumann in the Zoya Night Shift, right? And so you're right. So allowing these people to be human and allow them to be teenagers or very, very young when they're first mentioned. But he would still sit on, he drafted Brahms's first symphony. He drafted in 1854. He wouldn't publish it until 1876. And so in some cases, that kind of annoyance, that tossing out of Robert Schumann, absolutely not, but still sitting with that legacy of the mantle of Beethoven for 20 years speaks to me as having a lot of anxiety about putting that first step into the world. And so Matt, I want to ask you, we joke that Brahms 1 is Beethoven 10. Can you talk about why people make that joke?
I think it can start with the key with C minor. Granted, Beethoven 9 in being in D minor, but I think the similarities between that and the Fifth Symphony are there. I think the way that the movement transforms from C minor to C major, that fantastic, bright final movement, I think also does it. His ability to take small motifs and develop them in a way that clearly he learned from Beethoven, who of course learned this from Haydn. So there's a whole line of compositional thinking and approach that in many regards becomes elevated in the 19th century through a 19th century lens through Brahms. And even, speaking of motifs, that bump, 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 bump motif is pretty present in that symphony as well. So, so I think all those similarities can certainly make that apparent. But I think what one misses are some of the extraordinary things that Brahms does, whether it's, again, some of the harmonic progressions, there's some chorales in there that are in the last move that are really quite, go in a couple different directions, unexpectedly. The lyric gift that Brahms has that we don't necessarily, at least I don't personally often associate with Beethoven. There's also these very, very strong differences that still, yes, there's a lot of similarities, but this is, his first step into the symphonic form that he will continue to develop and evolve over the next three symphonies.
Great. And now let's it. I know I'm jumping all over the timeline and the multiverse here, but what's fascinating to me is that when he drafted that symphony, Robert Schumann was still alive. But then he had 20 years of friendship with just Clara before he published it. And so can we talk a little bit about the dynamic of Robert's last years with Clara, and then also with Brahms, and this phenomenal friendship that they kind of forged and then stuck to? And Nicole, I'm going to call on you for this.
Okay. So in terms of especially Robert's final years, and you see this throughout, there are evidence and there is clues to Robert's decline, I guess would be the best way to say it. The way that, and it's partially of the time to like talk in fragments and speak and kind of jumping around in more, maybe not quite as traditional spaces, but you see him in his letters, in some of his writing, like he'll just jump from topic to topic, which we do now, which is fine, but it kind of expresses some of that, the ways that Robert hits very high highs and very low lows, I think would be the best way to describe it. And 19th century medicine was not great. And he suffers from a lot of, I'm not going to diagnose him or anything, but he suffers from these, again, very high highs and very low lows. And he has eventually a very serious nervous breakdown. And he attempts suicide, and he is committed to a sanatorium or institution. And what is, I think, also really sad is Clara is forbidden from seeing him. It's a health thing, at least it's from what I understand, which to me sounds crazy and so sad. But in that time, and Clara had been dealing with Robert, she loved him, of course, but also dealing with these issues, and when he was really struggling, their kind of whole marriage. And there's times where, she can't perform because she's taking care of Robert. And then there are times where she has to perform because, they need to make money. Publishing made some money, but performing was, at least for them, was really a main source of income. And, Brahms had already become friends with them. But after this nervous breakdown, Brahms goes to Dusseldorf to help Clara. And also another aside is Clara had a lot of friends taking care of her children as well. I think like that's something that can kind of get lost in this whole topic, is like Clara had a lot of friends besides just Brahms and besides just Robert. Girl was a socialite in the like truest sense. She had so many musician friends, singers, violinists, pianists, so many people around her that both, supported her intellectually and musically, but also in the domestic space of, taking care of her children, which he's out on tour, those kind of things. But Brahms goes to Clara when Robert is committed, and helps, run some of the business dealings, some of the household, and takes care of the household also while Clara goes to perform to make money. And the way that I read it, the way that I've had it described and read it, is that Brahms really was into Clara. He seems to have formed a decently strong romantic attachment to her. And just like he viewed her as this perfect woman. To quote, to him, Clara Schumann, as a wife, mother, and musician, represented all that was ideal in womanhood. The way that he also valued her opinion a great deal about his music, sometimes to the point of like he would send her stuff and she would not have anything to say because she has other things going on. But the way that at least it seems is Clara liked Brahms, but like viewed, he was 20 years, not quite. He was very much her junior, and she viewed him a lot more as a son, and as a friend rather than a lover. That's from what I've understood. You can read into as much. There's a lot of reading into, as I was rereading some of my notes from my classes talking about these. Like I have stuff that I'm like, ooh, I don't think I have the evidence to quite back up that they were a thing. But you can read into you can read into the text as much as you want. That's certainly what the writers themselves were doing, reading into every single detail. So like, go off if you want. But like Brahms becomes this really big support system, but also like Clara had so many other supporters around her. She had, I'm forgetting his name. She had a duet partner who wasn't Brahms, who would she play piano duets with, who was just as much her partner, aside from Robert, especially once Robert had passed away.
Is it safe to say that Brahms ultimately became more reliant on the Schumanns than perhaps Clara was reliant on Brahms, as they disregarding how close they were as far as just like codependent relationships? Does that feel?
I don't know if I would go that far. I can't speak to how much, like, there were times where Clara absolutely leaned on Brahms in certain matters. I know that Brahms felt very indebted to Robert for how much he championed Brahms's works. So I know that there was, I would say probably the way that they gave and took were different, but I wouldn't describe as one over the other.
And Matt, do you think you could speak to what musically Brahms took from Schumann as he continued his career? Because obviously, like Brahms does not die until 1897. Funnily enough, Clara only predeceased him by a year. So Nicole, to quote you, she was booked, busy, and really booked and busy for a long time. So Matt, do you think we could talk about the Schumanns, Clara and Robert, where they might have shaped Brahms from there?
Well, I think I mentioned the article that Schumann wrote, but after Robert Schumann's death, I mean, we know that Brahms would send scores, like Nicole mentioned, and Clara Schumann would often give advice. She would, even after hearing piece, she would give advice or critiques on what she heard, and Brahms would, from what I understand from things I've read, like would often make changes and edits to his piece based off of what Clara suggested. So I mean, it's very clear that he held her in such high regard as he should have, that in anything that she said, he really took to heart very, very seriously, and would, there are a few occasions, I'm trying to remember now, a week or two ago, I read about this, and now I can't remember which piece, but she suggested something, editing a piece, and he kind of didn't take her advice on that one time, so there were a few times like that. But in general, from what I've read and what I understand is, anything that she would advise on his own music, like he would take very, very seriously. And then you talk about, just the performance aspect of it, as Nicole mentioned, like she was instrumental in getting his music out there and getting performances of the work and promoting his music. So I think that also, ties, all three of these, remarkable musicians together. And
she was, like you said, she was responsible for editing Robert's work long after he died and making sure it was. Do you think that because we do not have a lot of Clara Schumann compositions out there. We just don't. Her catalog is not nearly as big as Robert's, but her hand is in a lot of Robert's stuff. And so do you think, is there an argument to be made that by Clara spending her life both perfecting her own craft, editing her husband's work, getting it published, and constantly being exposed to the music of other composers like Brahms who wanted her opinion, that she in fact became someone, I'm going to say akin to Nadia Boulanger, who, this 20th century scion of all things amazing composers, maybe her own catalog doesn't match, but her influence becomes that much more important?
I would think so. Go on, Nicole. I'm sorry.
I was going to say that something that I looked at specifically for Clara, that we don't necessarily notice because we don't have a lot of physical materials that remain. But during these concerts that she would, recitals that she would put on, there's a lot of extra music that does not make it into the program, that does not make it into anything that we have. We'll see it in a review about Clara, about how beautiful she played, and what she played somewhat. But there's this whole extra thing of cadenzas 1, which I think is kind of where we see that we see where it is gone now, like in terms of modern music, like or modern performance of classical music is through cadenzas. But the improvisatory nature and outside of just the music itself was so important to this time period. I think Clara is, she's not the first to do it, but she is hugely influential in this, that, we then see it in Liszt and Paganini and all the names who I'm totally forgetting. But where all of this extra music that's just not written down comes from. So we see Clara's writing about Clara's prelude writing. She did a lot of, it's described about her concerts that there were little short preludes or pieces in between almost every single one of what was being performed. So she would play, she'd play, say, one of Robert's pieces. There'd be a little transition, and then she'd play a Chopin, connection afterwards, of where, being able to synthesize these musical ideas into, they are her own works, but they are still taking these things and putting it into a different language to help, not just champion these other works, but also to speak to the audience and help not warn, but alert the audience to what they should listen to ahead of time. Let's see. Clara's intention was to show the individuality of each master, to represent him, his innermost being with understandings and feelings, and that these preludes were effective in introducing potentially abstruse works to the public, aim of making complicated and unfamiliar works accessible to her listeners. So we don't have, we have some of her preludes and some of her improvisations written down somewhat at the behest of her daughters, but we don't have most of it. And so we only know what we've read. And I think that really speaks to, she was a woman, and there's a lot that society places around that. And in terms of a lowering of her placement in society, that ends up, we just don't have it written down or protected and saved to bring it to us, but that doesn't mean that it did not happen.
What a queen. But you know what that reminds me of is a couple of seasons ago we had Bruce Hornsby here on our rock series, and he surprised the pants off of our concert goers, because most of his music is inspired by Ives and Messiaen and all of these phenomenal 20th century composers who are still considered out of the box and off the wall, and he would play a noodle, a little bit of Ligeti or whatever it was before the piece that he was before the song that he was about to perform with the orchestra. He just sit at the piano and he'd talk and he'd noodle Ligeti, which was bonkers to me. But at the time, I imagine Clara Schumann noodling on some Chopin and doing random improvisation would be very, very similar. And being able to do that without having to sit and plan out meticulously, just have that language. That's so cool. It's just and obviously, Serena, I want to come back to you real fast, because we think of these composers as, for me, Brahms is larger than life, right? And so I really love any chance I get to see him as a human being. But I do find it interesting that he only wrote 4 symphonies. Schumann only wrote 4 symphonies before he died. Brahms had a much longer life. And I feel like so much of Brahms is encapsulated in each work, as opposed to Schumann, who just ran out of time. And so as you look forward to something like a Brahms 4, the final symphony of someone's output, as a conductor, where do you go to start that process?
Everything that we've talked about, I think, really highlights the importance of the kind of context in which he wrote that Fourth Symphony and everything that came before. I know there's a really fantastic book on Brahms and his life, a biography by Jan Swafford. That would be something that I'm sure, Matt, have you read? Yes. Then
Great. It's absolutely fantastic.
Please talk, feel free to add to this, but kind of like to start with something like that, to really be able to place that Fourth Symphony in everything that we've talked about, and then to look at, okay, is this a cyclic work where the structure of it, there is some of the movements are very famous, to where he does variations on the theme and all, and where that's placed in music history and what it influences afterwards, and things like that. That is kind of how I would approach looking at one of his symphonies, is probably a lot more background work than, for example, Robert Schumann, where his life was not that long, and had these kind of key moments. But for Brahms, where is that placed in his long life, and what are all the things that happened? I'm sure, Matt, you know from having read the book.
I can't remember the details, particularly around the fourth per se, but that book is really great in talking not just about his life, but how the music evolves as a result of his life, like you were talking about, Serena, and even getting into some details about the technical features and things like this. So it really is an absolutely fantastic book, I find. Anyways, I've read it a couple times now. My copy's it's starting to fall apart behind me here. So
for any fans of this podcast that would like to dive deeper into Brahms, that is a reading suggestion from Matt.
Yeah, highly recommended.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
You three are amazing. I think for our final thoughts is I still feel like we've barely scratched the surface. I did so many rabbit holes here, but as we go into the holidays and we start to look forward to all the incredible performances we get to play in the spring, this one was even more exciting now for me. Do we have any last thoughts that we want people to take with them, maybe specifically about Clara, or just how I keep going back to this incredible thought that no one is isolated ever, ever, ever. And no matter how much you think that not to say this in a negative way, no matter how much you think you've paved your own way, that's just simply not true. You have been influenced somehow along the way, or you've heard something has planted the seed, and you take it and grow with it. But last thoughts on maybe Clara's influence as she nearly got into the 20th century.
One thing I wouldn't mind saying, just because I've been spending the last couple of days listening with the score to the Schumann Piano Concerto, Clara Schumann Piano Concerto, is we talk about how great, what important figure she was. But I have to be honest with you, there were moments I actually laughed out loud when I was looking at the score and thinking about the mastery of the instrument, how incredible she must have been. I would love to be able to hear her play, just looking at what was happening in that piece. And then you think about the fact that she was 14 when she first sketched out the last movement, 16 when she added the first and second movement, and she finished it right before she was 16, premiered it shortly after. What a pianist this woman was. I mean, it's one of those things but then you look at the music, it's just like, holy smokes. This is just what I would give anything to just once be able to go back in time and hear her play, just because it is I literally started laughing out loud. It was so incredible what she was doing as a pianist. I would love to hear her play. So I did want to just as a quick, it's amazing.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the thing that I took away the most from when I was learning about kind of this time period, both in school and then for preparation of this, is just truly, it is wonderful that that it happened the way that it did. I would never ask for it to be anything different, because then it wouldn't be the same. But I just, I implore people to really take another look at what we do have of Clara, because truly, that is the thing I take away the most, is she was such an important figure, but also just an incredible talent. And what we do have of her is a small snapshot. And it is gorgeous. It is beautiful. It is such a encapsulation of so much of the time period, but also just, again, her own mastery of this instrument, the ability to take so many big things and make the piano at times sound completely just different and interesting, and it encapsulates so many ideas and thoughts. And she's a absolutely wonderful figure, and she deserves more information about her. And like, truly, everyone should listen to Clara Schumann at least like 5 times a year.
Her piano sonata is amazing. Absolutely incredible piece of music. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. This has been a delight. We're going to try and do this again. Spoiler, it'll most likely be for Bluebeard's Castle. So we're going to go from the uber positive to something not quite. Whew. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I can't thank you enough. What a joy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Serena. Thanks, Dani.
Thank you, guys. You're awesome.